first day of the week when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight.
Add to your faith virtue, to your virtue knowledge, to your knowledge self-control, to your self-control patience, to your patience godliness, to your godliness brotherly kindness, to your brotherly kindness add love.
The definition of faith, Hebrews chapter 11 defines faith for us, and it gives us examples of faith. And every single example that we have of faith is coupled with obedience.
I've heard before a connection in terms of mercy and grace. I think those two things are tied together. Mercy is God withholding what we do deserve. But when God is gracious, he's giving us what we do not deserve. And
Christians need to be mindful of that. You may have to sacrifice in order to have to obey God.
We need context, right? When we talk about authority in the scriptures and understanding the scriptures, we always have to talk about context.
It was a profound saying from Genesis 2. But what he was saying is it was really a shadow of the relationship of Christians and Christ, the church and Christ himself. Notice in verse 13 of Acts chapter 8, right? Even Simon believed and was baptized.
Simon the Sorcerer is a really good example of this, because it's very clear when you read Acts chapter 8 that Simon was saved. Nowhere does he say, I'm going to build my churches. Sometimes it's really hard, but you just can't quit. You got to keep going. And that's what Christianity is all about, is to keep going.
And the New Testament is that by which we will be judged. Now these were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word of God with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to find out if these things were so. Join us as we look into the inspired text of King Jesus with the same desire and approach to discover the will of God with Berean spirits. Hello and welcome back to Berean Spirits. My name is Chris Peltz. I'm the evangelist with the Southside Church of Christ here in Springfield, Missouri. We've got Richard Dodson with the Kearney Church of Christ up in Kearney, Missouri. Richard, how you doing today, man?
I'm fantastic.
Good to hear.
I better not be whining. Not today.
No, I don't want to hear it. That's for sure.
Not till after the show, anyway.
Yeah, well, that's the way it goes, it seems like. We've got Josh Thornhill with the Brookmead Church of Christ over in Johnson City, Tennessee. Josh, how are you today?
Never heard of him.
How much time you got?
Not enough to listen to you.
All right. Well, I'm doing okay.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. Man, it's beautiful weather here today. Man, it's hot, but it's great. And,
Is it fishing weather?
Good fishing weather. Good.
Oh, and we can find a shade tree to fish under, right?
Oh, I don't even need that, man.
Oh, yeah?
No. I just need water and fish to bite, and I'm good.
Yeah.
Yep. That's
the fish biting might, sometimes those fish whine,
Yeah, sometimes, especially brother-in-laws when you're not when they're not catching anything next to you.
They whine about my bait, that's for sure.
Why isn't he throwing something good?
Yeah.
Do I have to eat that color?
Yeah. Way it goes.
Yeah, you'd think they were wandering in the wilderness or something. Who knows?
You'd think. That's what there is such a thing called a Jewfish. Did
really?
You know that? Yes.
No,
I actually caught one when I was down in Florida. It's a
Oh, sorry.
Josh.
Well, I guess we better not delay.
Actually, no, I'm curious about the Jewfish, actually.
Yeah, it's a grouper. They called it a Jewfish. I mean, it's huge.
Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, the one I caught was just massive. So yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, that's cool. Got
it whined. Chris, that thing just whined the whole time till I got it in the boat.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just crying and crying. It whined so much we threw it back.
Yeah, man. You should have nicknamed it Josh.
This fish got even bigger every time I've heard this story.
Mm.
It was as big as the boat we were in.
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, yeah, today folks we are going to be talking about whining. There's several examples in the scriptures that we're going to be looking at. We're going to see what lessons we can learn and see if we can better our lives and better our relationship, not only with God, but with one another, and be better examples for those around us. Because when you think about whining, usually it's because of trials, tribulations, or, millennials. I mean, that's
now that's a good answer.
Ouch.
That's a good answer.
so.
Ouch.
I mean, we live in a society that's full of whiners and complainers. So
I take
but
offense to that.
you-
Chris.
there are some exceptions, um,
I
but
don't know.
I've heard, particularly Dave Ramsey, he talks about how he employs a bunch of millennials. And he says they either fall into one of two categories. They're either really great or they're the kind that we have the stereotypes about.
yeah,
Not so good.
yeah. And that, I mean, there's always exceptions to the rules. You think about hard workers and older folks, but there are lazy older folks too. But when we think about whining, Richard, probably one of the biggest or greatest examples of that would be the children of Israel when they left Egypt and were going through the wilderness on their way to the promised land.
I thought you were going to say I was the biggest example of.
Dude, what?
I am a whiner.
Why would I go
I am
there?
a whiner. I really am.
You are the biggest
listen,
example, but I
my
don't know
wife will
what.
tell you, I am the greatest example of whining, and I am also a perfect example of the Lord's patience, because every time I study about whining in the Bible, I'm like, woo, boy, the Lord spared me.
Amen.
But yes, you're right. The Israelites, they had. Now, of course, we have their account. We're just as guilty because we have their account. I mean, we weren't there to see it, but we have so much evidence. But then on the other hand, they were there. They saw first of all, they were afflicted. The 400 years. I mean, they were afflicted. And then, look what took place after that. I mean, you got the plagues of Egypt. They seen all that. They were released from Egypt. They got out to the Red Sea, and then there's the pillar of fire that held back Pharaoh's soldiers, and then all of a sudden, the biggest, parting the Red Sea. I mean, can you imagine seeing something like that? The reason why Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments is such a big hit is because of that scene. I mean, everybody watches and waits for the Red Sea to be parted. That's in a movie. They saw it in real life. Okay. I mean, that's just amazing. They get on the other side, and, Pharaoh sent his chariots in, and here comes the water and wipes them all out. And they're on the other side. Pharaoh's on the other side of the water, and they're safe. They know they've now been delivered. And this is the thing that just gets me is 3 days. Well, they sang the song of Moses, where they're praising God. I mean, they're just glorifying him. And you can read all about that in Exodus. I'm trying to, Exodus 15, I think. But, or was it 14? I can't remember, but right around in Exodus 14 or 15. Now I'm sounding like, no, it's Exodus 15.
You sound like Josh last week.
I know, but here we go. So they're singing praises to the Lord. You need to read the words of that song.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just praising God, praising God, praising God. And then the Lord, or Moses, sets them out. They leave the Red Sea, and they're in the wilderness for 3 days, and they found no water. And it says in verse 24, Exodus 15, they started complaining. And it's like, what are they thinking? Do they really think that the Lord went through all that trouble to deliver them out of Egypt? And he did all these things just to watch them die of thirst. But in 3 days, all they needed them, he just needed them to endure a little bit here, and they started complaining. It's like children when you go on a trip. I remember we used to go on road trips, and I won't say which child, but I'd say, "Are we ready to go?" And the kids are, "Oh yeah," they're all gung ho, they're ready, and I mean, 30 minutes down the road, heavy sigh. When are we going to get there? And in your mind, you're like, my lands, this is like a 2-day journey here. And it's they were so gung ho, and they couldn't last 30 minutes. And that's exactly what the Israelites were, Chris. They were grumbling, they were complaining in such a short period of time, and it didn't stop there. Now, I've been going for a while, so I'll stop now. But it's not an attractive trait in people, and it's definitely not something that's going to endear you to the Lord.
Yeah, no, it certainly isn't. And it's interesting too, because after, they went 3 days, as you pointed out, but then you think about the situation that they were in. Their clothes were not wearing out, their sandals were not wearing out. It's not like they were actually thirsty. I mean, God was providing for them and preserving them for this journey, for this trip. And yet, it was things they were used to, right? Like maybe we ought to be drinking, we ought to be eating something. Where is all of this stuff? And so, God, God was listening to them. He was hearing them. He wasn't happy about the whining and complaining by any means, but he provided these things to them. But it was still the point that, when people engage in the whining, it really shows a little bit about where their focus is. Usually it's selfishness. Usually it's all about their self, oneself, and the focus is not on God, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the whining that takes place.
Well, it's a lack of faith.
Exactly. It is a lack of faith. And so, Josh, when you think about this particular situation, as we get ready to look at some other examples of this, this is something that, sermons, not just, you could have a series of sermons about, Israel going and whining and complaining in the wilderness.
Yes, that's true.
Pull the rope, Chris. Pull the rope.
I'm testing you to see if you have something to whine about. Mm-hmm. As you look at the example, particularly in the wilderness, as Richard has pointed out already, you've got Israel witnessing all this power from the hand of God. And then they come to the wilderness and start complaining. And then they go to Mount Sinai, where they witness the presence of God descending upon the mountain, and they hear the voice of God. And yet all they seem to ever do is complain. And then throughout the wilderness, as Chris pointed out, as they're being provided for by God, they continue to just complain and whine and gripe and complain and whine and gripe. And then they come to the promised land, and they send the 12 spies in. And the 10 spies come out and say, "Oh, it's much too big. We're never going to be able to take it." I think the part of the problem there is not so much that they got intimidated by the Canaanites, but the fact that they didn't trust in God. They weren't just rejecting the promised land. They were rejecting God and his provision and his care for them and his walking with them. And they were failing to trust in him and all that he had constantly done for them. It's like a child that becomes ungrateful And then the parent says, but look what all I've done for you. I've fed you every day of your life. I've given you a roof over your head. I've provided clothing for you. I give you transportation to all these activities you've wanted to do. I've given you all these toys and everything that you could ever want. And you're still not grateful. And that's the way it was with Israel. God had done so much for them, and yet all they did was whine about it, whine about every little minor inconvenience.
Yeah.
And I think, as Richard has pointed out, we're no better than Israel is, because we've been blessed tremendously, particularly in the United States of America, and yet we whine and complain about every little thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and it is sad. It really is. But let me ask you
Chris,
guys.
can I want to get back to the 12 spies.
Okay, real quick. But then I've got a question, because I'm gonna go back even further than that, because I want folks to.
I just want to know what the Lord's reaction was to that in Numbers 14.
Mm-hmm.
Because he said to Moses, how long will the people despise me? How long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs I've done among them? Verse 12, I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make you a nation greater and mightier than they. And of course, he goes on. Moses intercedes for them and spares them of that. But I just bring that up to show you that, Lord don't like whining.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, he really doesn't like whining. I mean, if he's going to strike him with pestilence, he about had enough.
Yeah, that's right. But well, let me ask you guys this then. What's the difference between the whining that they did in the wilderness, okay, and before Moses came to deliver them, being oppressed by Egypt? God heard their cries. Right? Isn't there a difference between what was taking place there and not just the situation? I mean, granted, the circumstances, made a big difference, but God looked at that not with grumbling. God wasn't angry with the people about their crying out. Really, in one sense, you could even say whining and complaining about the oppression that they were under by Egypt, but God looked at that differently than what they were doing in the wilderness. And the reason I bring that up is I think sometimes, there's a difference between, when you're going through trials and tribulations, whining is usually over something that either is insignificant or can easily be fixed if you would just do something about it yourself. Or rely upon God, right, and put it upon Him, as opposed to something that is a little bit more serious. Am I missing something here?
No,
I agree.
You want to hit it, Josh, or you want me to do it?
Sure. Okay. Wait, what were you saying, Chris? I forgot. I think you're particularly referencing Exodus chapter 2, where obviously Pharaoh, because of his own insecurity, begins to oppress the Israelites further and make their lives more difficult. And it says that they cried out their cry for help. They cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning and remembered His covenant with Israel. I think it's important within this context to remember that there is a place for legitimate complaints. In the case of Exodus chapter 2, Israel was being abused. I mean, what Pharaoh was doing was wrong. The way he was treating this people was wrong. And they had a legitimate complaint, and they cried out to God for deliverance. And I think that is appropriate within reason, obviously. But there is cases where there are legitimate complaints to be made. And just because somebody voices their displeasure at a given situation doesn't mean that they're just whining for no reason. In Acts chapter 6, you find it describes the Hellenistic widows had been overlooked in the daily serving of food. Now, that's not just them whining because they didn't get as much as anybody else. They were being overlooked. They were being neglected, and that was a legitimate problem. And so that bring attention to that wasn't wrong in and of itself. But I think where whining comes in is too often we're just not content with what we have, and so we're just going to complain instead of seeking a valid solution. I think with Israel in Exodus chapter 2, they're crying out to God, not just that they're sitting there whining, oh, poor pitiful me, but they're crying out to God for deliverance. And I think the problem with complaining is too often we're just moving our lips without trying to work toward a solution. We're just kind of whining.
Yeah. Yeah. And when they were whining in the wilderness, it wasn't, Lord, give us something to drink. Is why have you brought us out here to die? We should go back to Egypt. And it wasn't looking for a solution. And I think that's part of really what whining is about. It's really about attention. It's really about selfishness. And it's not about finding a solution to the problem or the issue.
Right.
John Mundy made a comment. John Mundy's got a brand new granddaughter. I don't know if you guys saw the picture.
Congratulations. Yeah.
It's cute. It is cute. Luckily, it doesn't look like John. But I didn't say that. No. John says crying is the only way a baby can express a need. However, those who are mature should, 1, be content. Philippians 4:11, Hebrews 13:5. 2, express our desires to God, 1 John 5:14. And 3, have faith that God will give us what we need according to his will, Matthew 6:31 through 34. And John, I want to thank you for that sermon outline you just gave me. But I think about you talking about the Israelites. I think what John just said applies in that situation because at that point, many of them had not known God the way they were about to know God. I mean, when they started seeing his works, that's a different story. I mean, they were more mature in their belief of God once they crossed the Red Sea than they were when they were in bondage. Now they had the promises of God. They knew they hadn't been fulfilled yet as far as the making the promise to Abraham, making his seed a great nation. And they probably knew what Joseph had told his brothers, but there was a lot of things that they were immature about. But as John was pointing out, there comes a time when the Lord expects more of you. And after what they saw, they experienced, I would say at that point, there was more expected of them. And yeah. I think what John pointed out is I think there's a correlation there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so let's go to the New Testament now for a few minutes, because really that's where we have some of these differences and where we can make some application. We got James chapter 1, verse 2, for example, where he says, my beloved brethren, count it all joy when you fall under various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. And you look at this text, talking about, being joyful in trials and tribulations and difficulties. And that's usually where the whining and complaining comes in. And God says, hey, there's good that can come of this. And so sometimes it's a matter of perspective, how we're looking at this. Are we looking at this with an eternal perspective, or simply selfishness and worldliness? And he says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. And that's, I think brings up, this idea of, the difference between making a legitimate complaint that Josh pointed out, as opposed to just whining about something. Paul wasn't whining about the thorn in the flesh, 2 Corinthians there in what chapter 12. That wasn't a whining that Paul was going through. He was going to God. And I think that's one of the points that John Mundy made, in his comment, is take it to God. And that's what Paul did. He took it to God and, remove this. And of course, God said no, with reason, but, then Paul moves on. Whereas the whiners don't move on. I mean, that's all they do. That's all they talk about. Just over and over and over again, whining and complaining. And even when explanations or rather solutions are offered or given, that's not what they want. The whiner is all about just the whining itself. It's as though they don't want the issue or the problem fixed. They just want to talk about it and whine about it and do nothing about it. And that's a problem.
Yeah, it is a problem. And I think you expect it with new converts, and I can understand it with new converts because learning to walk by faith is a difficult thing. And I think we see that, in the New Testament with, for instance, the church at Corinth. Um, there's things that they need to learn, and these very things, such as whining, they were told about this. But there is a deeper meaning to Christianity that eventually you have to figure out. You're going to have to mature and understand what the Lord expects from you, and some of these things that afflict us it happens for a reason. And so, we have to understand that when these things happen, we may not understand the reason for it, but we have faith in God. And we know that, Romans 8:28, all things work together for good for those who love the Lord, who are called according to his purpose. And that's why, the apostle Paul could say in Colossians 1:24-26, I rejoice in my sufferings, for your sake. And so there are things that Christians are to go through that may not be convenient for them, that may be difficult to endure, but it may be the will of God for some reason. There may be a purpose behind that. And whatever, like the apostle Paul and his thorn in the flesh, there was a purpose behind that. And you're going to have to believe that God loves you and he wants the best for you. And if there's something going on that's causing you some kind of difficulty, there's a reason for that. And you need to put your faith in God and endure it and be joyful instead of starting whining. Oh, yeah, the Lord's making me do this. This is horrible. Why didn't Jesus help me with this? I mean, that is so easy to do, and the Lord hates it.
Yeah, and you
you
missed
gotta
the
bring
point
me
that
up,
the
Richard?
Lord is
Uh-oh.
helping you. Go ahead, Josh.
So why you got to bring me up, Richard? I like that third point that John had pointed out earlier, with the having faith that God will give us what we need according to his will. We mentioned a couple weeks ago, whenever it was, when we were talking about providence. Sometimes the answer is no. And we can whine and complain and do whatever, but the answer is no. And we need to learn to, by faith, accept that. And that's hard. But as Richard pointed out, sometimes that no is because it wasn't in our best interest. Sometimes we have to realize that God says no for our own benefit, for our own protection and care.
Are in the best interest of our cause, which is saving souls. I mean,
Right.
Jesus, right? Jesus was in the garden. He prayed 3 times, and the answer was no. Why? Well, not just because his best interest, but in, if he endured this, there was going to be a lot of people saved.
Yes. And I came across something a while back that said, when a door closes, it's because what was behind it wasn't meant for you. And sometimes that's hard. Sometimes we're going to complain about it. Sometimes we get upset and we start questioning God. But we need to trust him. He knows what he's doing. I might not understand it. I might not get it. And I don't have to get it. I just need to trust him.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with complaining. I want all the answers. I want everything to go swimmingly. I want everything to be perfect and fine and dandy. But life's not that way. And so I need to get to a point where I don't need all the answers. I just am content trusting the one who has them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And when we develop that level of contentment, and by the way, Paul says in Philippians 4, I have learned in every state to be content. It's not natural. He's learned how to be content. We would do well to strive to learn contentment.
Yeah. In fact, in that very context, verses 11, 12, he immediately goes then to verse 13, then I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, contentment is really what it's all about. 2 Timothy chapter 4, gets into that as well. And that's a point that we miss too often, because that idea of contentment, not only in our situations, in our life, in our circumstances, realizing that God is going to be with us, right? I mean, that's the whole point of being a child of God, is understanding that even when things get difficult and are hard, first of all, God's made a promise that when there's temptations that are before us, there's always a way of escape. We just have to look for it, have to rely upon him. But too often people just simply complain about it and do nothing. And some applications, you think about, work of local churches. There's a lot of people that complain about things not getting done, and yet they do nothing to help get it done. Right. I mean, that's whining and complaining in a very, negative way, not asking questions or trying to help a situation, but really just pointing the finger at everyone else. And that doesn't help the situation. And that just makes things even worse. And I think about the, John chapter 12. There was the woman that came in and anointed Jesus' feet with that expensive oil, and Judas was like, man, she should have took that and sold it. And Jesus like, leave her alone. Sometimes we whine and complain about things that it's not even any of our business, or it's just doesn't even have anything to do with us. And people just like to whine and complain, and it's not healthy. And it really can destroy congregations. It can destroy the work and the morale of a local work, when all you want to talk about are negative things, because ultimately that's what whining is all about, is just really focusing on everything negative and losing sight of all the positives.
I think we mentioned a minute ago the idea of there are places for legitimate complaints. I think the legitimate way to express complaint is not to just sit there, well, this is a problem, and just talk about how horrible of a problem it is, but rather, you know what, I've noticed there's a problem here, and here's a solution. Let's try and work toward this solution.
I'm sorry, you sounded like Deputy Dog.
Who?
Go ahead.
I was waiting. I knew the who was coming. Who?
All right, go ahead, Josh. You're fine.
Well, my point was, in order a legitimate complaint is going to offer solution and work toward the resolution. If you're not working towards resolution, you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
Especially by complaining.
Yeah.
So when we do have a complaint, number one, pray about it. But number two, figure out a way that you can be part of the solution. What can I do to help resolve this problem, and go about doing that?
Yeah.
And if more people would do that, we wouldn't have nearly as much complaining in the Lord's church.
Yeah.
another thing that I think needs to be pointed out is the fact that
Point it out,
sometimes
Richard.
I'm going to, sometimes the afflictions that come upon people are self-inflicted. It's their own fault.
Mm-hmm.
And they whine about it and complain about it, but I mean, they did it to themselves. And a lot of times it's the consequences of sin. And the Lord has warned over and over again about consequences of sin. But if you don't take advantage of, like, for instance, I mean, you can tell your child, don't touch the stove. If you do, it's going to burn. It's going to hurt. And if they go over there and they touch the stove and it burns them, they cry. I mean, who's that on? Is it on you? Is it on them? Well, they were told, they were warned. They did it anyway. They just ignored the words of exhortation. And that's what a lot of times happens with people today is they have self-inflicted problems because, as Jesus put it, they were playing with fire. You play with fire, you're going to get burned. You can't take fire into your bosom and not get burned. I mean, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so you can't, but you can't blame God for that. That can happen to any of us, and it does happen to any of us. Once those consequences happen, then you're going to have to. The Lord will help you deal with it. Your brethren will help you bear your burden, but you can't whine about it. You did it, so you just got to deal with it.
So that is true. I mean, and I don't know if I would say most of the time, majority of the time, half the time, but at least some of the time. Absolutely, it is self-inflicted. But at the same time, there are situations that are not self-inflicted. And I'm going to use a personal, and usually I don't get too personal on here, but I will today. Right. So when I was 10 years old, I was diagnosed with RP, a degenerative eye disease. And I was told I'm going to lose my sight. And my dad let me whine for a year. I mean, and almost a year to the day of being diagnosed with RP, my dad comes in 4:00 in the morning, grabs the side of my mattress and picks it up and rolls me out of bed to get up and go work on the farm. And he told me that day, I'm going to have to work twice as hard when I get out of his house. I might as well start now. And the point was, I can sit and whine and complain and bemoan my situation, or I can not let it define me, and I can go out and I can work and make something of myself and of my life in spite of the circumstances that I'm facing. And so, I talk to a lot of people that sit back in situations that are not self-inflicted, and they whine and complain, and it is a difficult thing. Like I said, I did it for a year, as a child. I whined and complained and bemoaned, what was happening to me, but ultimately that did nothing for me. It got me nowhere. And it would continue to get me nowhere, just as today would be the same thing. And so, the question is, all right, that this is what you're dealt. This is the situation you find yourself in. Rather than complain and whine about it, work through it and rely upon God to help you. And as you pointed out, Richard, even when sometimes things are self-inflicted, as a Christian, I mean, that's one of the greatest things, not only having God on your side, but brothers and sisters in Christ that help you and encourage you and get you through those situations, and really showing you that you don't have a reason to whine and complain, but a reason to be thankful. And Josh, I think you've got a quote on that. And so, but that's really what we need to be, is find the things to be thankful for.
Right. I'm trying to think about what the quote is that I have.
You mentioned it before we went on the air about being thankful.
I don't remember.
Yeah. Oh, that figures. Man,
well,
I get an
anyway.
opportunity to shine, and you let us all down.
Well, I do anyway, so
But I think what Chris said is a good point, because the Lord does provide. I can't help but think of a young lady who who gets herself in a predicament because she commits fornication, and so she becomes pregnant, and she has this baby, and she doesn't have a husband. And what's she to do? It's a scary situation, but she's got brethren. I mean, she can ask the Lord to forgive her, but she still has this consequence of sin. And there's no way to put it. I mean, when you sin like that and there's consequences of it, you have to deal with it. So now, not only does she have to feel the brunt of the consequences of sin, but even the child who's innocent has to feel the consequences of sin. But the Lord says, here, I'm going to give you a bunch of brethren here. They're going to help you with that. And so instead of that child not having, things that it needs, now he's got a whole congregation full of grandparents and uncles and aunts and people who's going to care for him and help her raise that child and make it easier for her to bear that burden. And that's what the Lord wants us to do. And instead of whining about it, we should be thanking the Lord for providing for us in a way that He will help us. I'm just using that sin as an example, but any sin where there's consequences that you have to bear that burden, the Lord's provided people, a family, to help you endure that, and that didn't even count, about what the Lord's doing behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Sure.
I mean that's something. Instead of whining about it, be thankful.
Yeah.
And I will say, brethren, if in that situation that you've described there, brethren need to make sure that they are being compassionate towards the sister who has repented of that sin.
Absolutely.
And that's
Yeah.
part of the grace of the gospel that we need to be showering upon our brothers and sisters in Christ. That's important. But I did remember, I think, the quote that you were talking about, Chris. I had heard someone say before that perhaps one of the greatest sins that we can commit is a lack of gratitude. Considering all that God has done for us, considering all that we've received from Him, to turn around and complain to Him is one of the biggest insults that we can commit toward God. Mm-hmm. And I do think, though, that a lot of times, as we've described here, a lot of times people get themselves into trouble or into bad situations, and they keep doing the same things, and they keep getting the same results, and then they complain about their bad luck. It's like, well, maybe you need to take a look in the mirror here. Maybe you need to do some self-reflecting and see what's causing me to remain in this position, or what's causing me to keep getting this result. And maybe I need to change something. Maybe I need to stop doing this so that way I can get myself to a better position. And sometimes we blame God, or we complain and whine and do all these things when it's our fault in the first place. There was a meme where there's a lion sleeping on the ground, and there's a monkey with a stick walking up behind it like it's about to hit it. And it says everything happens for a reason, and sometimes that reason is you're stupid and make bad decisions. Yeah. And we might complain because the lion is coming to attack us, but if you're waking the lion up with a stick, well, what do you expect?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. That's right. Man, I tell you what, I think this has been a good conversation, guys. This is, I've given folks some things to think about. And I think one of the first things we should do, as you point out, is self-examination, right? Examine yourself. Is what you talk about, is what you bring up to others, first and foremost, a complaint about things that are going on that you have no control over? Or is it thankfulness and gratitude for all the blessings and everything we have in our relationship with God and brothers and sisters in Christ? What's the thing you want to talk about most? What's the thing you find yourself talking about most? And is it negative or is it positive? Is it whining and complaining, or is it thankfulness for the blessings we have? And if it's whining and complaining, a change needs to take place. All right. And we need to be more thankful for what we have, the blessings we have, the strength we have from God, so that we can move forward in a better situation. Because I'll tell you this, people talk about right now evangelism and how hard it is to evangelize, right? And they start whining and complaining about the difficulties and the attitudes of those in the world. And really what we're doing is getting sucked into those attitudes, whereas we can have an influence on them with positivity and with the grace and mercy that God is offering and showing them the gospel of Christ, the joy we have as Christians. And when we do that, then we can change the mentality of those around us, because generally, especially if we're outspoken in some way, we can set the tone for those who are around us. And if we decide that the tone needs to be all focused upon God and blessings and gratitude, thankfulness, then that can set a tone for those around us. Less whining will take place, and the seeing of the blessings will be more abundant as well. Richard, any last thoughts?
Yeah, while you were talking, I remembered a woman we used to have at Kearney that she's passed away now, but whenever somebody was talking about something that was going on at church, she would say, "Well, I just don't know what they're doing down there," talking about it, the church building, what they're doing. And, I would always correct her and I'd say, what we're doing, not there, we. And I would say that over and over again, like, hey, you're part of this. Be a part of it. And this gets back to what Josh said. Be a part of the solution. If there's problems happening, be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Josh, last thoughts?
I may have mentioned this on here before, but several years ago, I was in a low position, a low place, and just the circumstances at that point were not ideal, and I was really down. And I had called a friend of mine, and I was probably going to do some complaining. But she suggested, why don't we go back and forth and start counting our blessings. And so for, I don't know how long, 10, 15, 20 minutes or so, we just took turns where we described our blessings. And that's powerful.
Yeah.
It changes your mindset. It changes, because what you're doing when you're complaining, too often what you're doing is you're just focusing on the negative and how awful your life is and poor pitiful me. And that's kind of what Job does for a part. But when we take our focus off of ourselves and remind ourselves that, yeah, this is bad, but we have so much to look forward to, and we have so much to be thankful for, really puts that negative thing in perspective. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, I believe verse 17, our light affliction, which is but for a moment. That's perspective there for you. Mm-hmm. And so keep that perspective and count your blessings.
Absolutely. Yeah. Amen. All right, folks, we appreciate everybody tuning in. The comments we receive, everybody hits that subscribe button and like and shares it out with others. Always a big help for us. And again, you're such an encouragement to us, and hope that we can be an encouragement to you as well every Thursday morning here at 10 o'clock Central Time. And remember to search the scriptures daily with Berean Spirits.
Thank you for watching Berean Spirits. Visit our website, bereanspirits.com.